By noon, the valley lay chalked in glare and heat shimmer, a wide pan between low ranges that looked close enough to pocket and somehow never moved nearer. I parked the truck where the graded track broke into pale alluvium and signed the field sheet with a dry pen that whispered on the paper. I clipped the sun hood over my cap brim and pulled the Yagi from its padded sleeve, light but stubborn with its thin booms catching at air. The VHF handset rode in a chest sling where my knuckles could find the push-to-talk by habit. The Spectrum logger sat in its foam bed like a quiet animal that only ever spoke in graphs. I checked the spare batteries by their weight in my palm and their rattle in the case. The job was simple. Traverse the floor, gauge corridor coverage for the repeater on the north spur, and trace a hiss that operations had heard in the band edges during midday for the past week. Heat makes waves. Metal makes its own decisions if you let it. That was the kind of day we had. The desert had its own sound even when I cut the engine. Wind wore a fine grit that ticked at the hoops of the antenna. Somewhere a small fly droned like an untuned carrier and then went to ground. I logged initial conditions in plain language because the logger would forget the sun but remember squares. Air sharp, light white, ground loose, heat dancing. The checklist steadied me. Assemble Yagi. Confirm cokes clean and tight. Inspect connectors for dust bloom. Power cycle handset to clear any sticky state. Start the logger on a sweep that would walk the band with patient teeth. I faced the first waypoint, not by numbers, but by a notch in the ridge that looked like a chipped bowl, and began to cross. Midway through the first leg, the radio returned a sound to me that should not have been mine. I had keyed up to send a method note on simplex to the truck recorder, just a routine bark of the procedure to pin my steps to a voice. My words came back after a breath, thinner, compressed as if through cloth, a copy with the tone of a recording made in a tiled room. I heard myself say the line again and felt the skin tighten along my jaw. The logger scrolled in its small way. The trace did not show a matching rise where my call had been. I waited to decide if my brain had done the echo and then tried again with a shorter phrase. The valley returned that too, not as a bounce-off rock, not as the long thread you get under cloud, but as a small, clean double that arrived a heartbeat late. I noted it without judgment. Heard delayed return on voice, no corresponding spike on sweep, air steady, no visible dust lanes aloft. The guidebook would have me blame a thermal layer bending sound, a hot backbeat sending voice to some edge and back along a curve. But the radio did not ride air the same way as a shout, and the kind of delay I heard suggested a path through a shape I could not invite by adjusting my posture. I turned the Yagi and peered along its line as if eyes could see a refraction. The array felt precise and then strange, the balance of it subtly off, like a wrench you think you know that someone has milled down when you are not looking. I set it on the case lid, counted nothing, and lifted again to reset my grip and send another fragment. Field unit testing corridor, receive check. The copy came back with my own grit in it, the burr of my throat intact but dulled, a spoon tapped inside a cup. I walked. The valley's floor ran in delicate ripples, frozen from an old wash. Creosote kept its distance from the center like something had drawn a circle once and never erased it. When the wind went quiet, there was the smell of warmed clay, not unpleasant, and underneath it a faint tang as if a battery had sighed. The logger picked up a seam near the lower edge of our licensed block where we expected nothing. It was a thin visit, a whisker that rose and laid down as though embarrassed. I swept back and forth to make sure it was not my hand. The trace held its modest art. I marked a waypoint by a shale triangle and shifted to a different gain profile to test if the whisker belonged to the instrument. The whisker declined to be an artifact. It sharpened when the Yagi's booms aligned with a dry arroyo that braided the floor like a forgotten rope. At the arroyo, I crouched to shade my eyes and saw in the soft wall a series of pocks where stones had been pulled by last monsoon. At the bottom were tracks that did not decide if they belonged to a two-legged animal or a small, odd cart. Pairs of prints, then a single long drag, then pairs again, like a walker who sometimes floated. The spacing made no sense for a stride unless the heat had lifted the prints and laid them back wrong. I told myself they were old. The valley has time. The smell of battery crouched harder in that cut, and I could not locate a cause. No dumped cells, no hive of hornets eating metal. The logger's whisker breathed a little higher and then fell again to the floor. I spoke to the recorder that I had found minor unlicensed behavior near the edge and would continue to trace. The recorder would write it down. Paper loves weak things that stay. The handset behaved fine until I reached the center of the floor, where the mirage made a lake I did not believe in. There, I pressed the transmit as a proof of life, and nothing went out. The bar that lies to you about strength lay still. I switched to a second channel, not for help, just for test, and found a soft blanket instead of air. I stepped a pace back the way I had come, and the blanket lifted. One pace forward and the world became cotton again. I marked the boundary with a rock the size of a small melon and stepped through the curtain as if into a freezer. The sunlight baked the top of my hands, and yet the skin along my forearm cooled and the hair there lifted. I stood one beat and stepped back out where sweat knew its role. The logger did not change its mood. The handset reported a stable silence within that small brace of ground and nothing else. Dead zone, round as a kitchen lid in the middle of nothing. I circled it not to summon anything, only to know. And the circle tracked me like a companion who keeps your shoulder equal to theirs. I tell it like the map does not drift, but it did. There is a habit you pick up in an empty place of keeping 3 points the same between blinks. The notched ridge, a pair of telephone poles retired on a berm, and the dent in a low hill to the south. If you can hold 3, you are still. As I skirted the lid on the ground, my 3 lost their triangle and tried to be a straight line. The pole pair slid toward the notch when I looked at the dent, and when I pursued the trick by staring longer, they retreated like polite thieves. I said the names of the points out loud, because voice fixes the world even when math will not. The echo did not answer that time. It was my voice only in my ears, and I felt an odd relief that the valley had not decided to keep me company again. I set the Yagi down and drank water with my head under the sun hood, and the air smelled briefly like hot coins. I resumed the sweep with a different cadence, longer dwell on the bands more likely to hold unruly visitors. The whisker returned with better posture, a sign that the valley liked me moving. The dead zone held its round and made no moral claim. The handset offered a tiny scrape when I lifted it over my head, as if a key rattled in a tin somewhere just beyond the range of seeing. I keyed up again to the truck recorder and said that I would move toward the north-spur to cross-check line of sight and then loop back by the old mining fan east of the wash. The copy I waited for did not arrive. Instead, the valley gave me a breath that was the length of a short memory and then pronounced my plan back to me in my own cadence, but clipped, the way a student repeats a sequence they almost know. The logger wrote nothing. The Yagi tugged in my hands with a fine nervousness, a bird considering flight. A pickup passed on the highway a long mile away and threw a brief toss of white noise into the bowl. The echo held off until the noise had gone, as if it had stepped aside to let traffic pass. The sun angled down just enough to silver the scrub and show me that the tracks in the arroyo had softened at their edges since I first saw them. I could not make a case to myself for wind doing it. The air was too still. I could not make a case to myself for my own boot brushing them. I had walked clean. The boundary of the dead zone had crept half a boot length closer to the rock I had placed. I told myself I had misremembered and made the reminder gentle, like you talk to someone on a tall ladder. The job remained the job. Confirm coverage, trace anomaly, document, do not name. I moved on, steady, because steady is what you owe the people who will work here later with their own batteries and their own small patience. At the foot of the north spur where the rock started to show bone, I stopped and turned once to look back over the valley. The heat seemed less now, or I had learned to carry it. The lake of mirage had become a mirror laid thin along the ground, and in that mirror I saw a line that was not a line until I moved. When I held still, it faded. When I took a slow step, the line sharpened and ran away toward the arroyo as if dragging a string. The logger caught another whisker at the same edge, and I felt a tiny, virtuous pride that the instrument and my eyes agreed. I said into the handset that I was marking a provisional corridor for interference. The valley repeated me with the mildest humor, like a clerk humming while stamping a document. I stood quiet and let the heat press my shirt to my back. The only smell was sun on canvas, and that faint battery note that came and went, like a breath under a door. I thought about how thin the rules are out here, and how often they work anyway, how a list in your pocket can talk you home. I sat on the tailgate and wrote field notes until the pen warmed to my fingers again. Under significant sun, midday, weak intermittent carrier observed near lower edge, no clear source, apparent spatial pocket of silence in center floor, returns of voice not matched by trace. I did not write the part about my own words coming back like a small, tired cousin. That would go in later if it persisted, if it deserved a line. I capped the pen, lifted the Yagi, and stepped off the tailgate back into the floor because no one else was going to walk the rest of it. The valley gave no complaint, it only waited, as if timing me. I started the second leg with the Yagi resting against my shoulder, letting the booms tick to the rhythm of my steps so I could hear if anything else tried to hide in that metronome. The sun hood threw a small private shade over my eyes and made a theater out of the world. I kept my checklist near the front of my mind and spoke pieces of it when breath allowed. Confirm gain baseline, sweep broad, narrow on lift, compare to prior notes, put edges on a thing before you try to move it. The handset tapped my sternum with each stride, and the spectrum logger purred like stove gas in its little cradle. Far off, the spur showed pale ribs, and between here and there the valley lay like a sheet spread neatly over something that did not quite have corners. I worked the gain up in steps and watched the trace fatten as expected. Then I eased it back and waited for the fat to drain. It did not. The trace held like a held breath, and then, as if to be contradictory, it went louder when I lowered the gain by another click. The logger did not know it was supposed to be ashamed. I held still and tried the handset as if I were asking a friend to confirm a rumor. Field unit, gain test, valley floor. The reply arrived with that tiled room timbre, but now it came quicker. So quick I could not tell if it was after or with me. I said a nonsense syllable to hear whether a word carried the trick or the act of speaking did. The valley returned the little sound exactly, shy and perfect, as if fear of meaning had made it obedient. When gear refused the rules, you either fix the gear or fix the rules. I sat in the small shadow of the truck's tailgate and ran the coax through my fingers, feeling for a burr or a loose weave. Nothing snagged. I unseated the connectors, breathed across them, reseated until the threads laid down smooth. The Yagi eye balanced across my thighs and looked for a hairline I could blame. It had come to me clean from the shop, and I had not knocked it against anything more than the air. The logger eye power cycled and gave it time to forget, then told it the story again from the beginning. When I stood, the heat dragged at my calves and the smell of baked metal rose from the case latches. I set gain to the bottom of my working range to prove a point. The trace put on a small coat, as if I had fed it. I laughed once, something dry that surprised me. The arroyo called me back, not with sound, but with a sense that the valley moved when I did not look. I cut toward it, eyes on the same 3 points, and found I could hold them for longer if I spoke them under my breath. Notch, dent, poles. The dead zone lid, the round of silence, had drifted into the path I would have chosen. I walked its edge, careful, holding the hand set out and letting the small mute press against it like the muzzle of an animal testing your palm. I stepped in, and the air went quilted. I stepped out and the valley came back with a tiny rasp as if the world cleared its throat. Inside that circle, the delayed copy did not play. It was my voice alone, swallowed at the edges. I stood in the center, counted by feeling the pulse in my neck and not by naming numbers, and came out again with the itch of wrongness along my wrists. At the arroyo, the pox in the wall had slumped a little more. The tracks I had told myself were old had grown blurrier on one side while sharpening on the other, like a hand pushing clay around. I crouched and found the faintest mark of a heel, and then a long slide that turned into nothing, no expected toe dig to end it. The smell of battery had deepened to the sweetness of a coin warmed in a pocket. I took photos for the report, mud, wall, my boot placed alongside for scale without the sin of measures, and then spoke a field note into the recorder. Uneven drift in trace versus gain, dead zone migrates, arroyo impressions unstable, metallic odor present. As I capped the recorder, the handset whispered, not static, but a near whisper, as if cloth brushed cloth near the mic. I lifted it. A phrase came through that I recognized by rhythm before content. It was the end of what I had just said, the fragment about odor, trimmed and soft, turned back to me with a smaller throat. The next sweep I ran with the Yagi tilted, as if listening around a corner. The logger returned a sawtooth that did not belong to any licensed partner. It rose and fell with the patience of something testing limits. When I was still, it settled. When I walked, it grew an extra tooth, then another, like steps drawn by a child who has learned repetition but not pattern. I found a shallow ridge of gravel and climbed it to gain an inch more of the world, and the sawtooth collapsed to a flat line as if embarrassed to be seen. Energy will make a liar of your eyes and ears if you let it. I stood with my back to the ridge and stared at the floor of the valley without moving my head, the way you look past your own reflection into a window at night. The mirage shimmer dragged a thin lip of silver across the mud, and I thought I saw my own shoulders in it, but thinner, an outline only, a tracing done by a patient child. Orders had been clear before I left town: confirm corridor, do not escalate, file the anomaly with the short form. The short form has small boxes and does not like sentences that wander. I could feel the tug toward obedience and the tug toward curiosity, and the straps of my chest sling creaked when I took a fuller breath. The heat complicates judgment. It puts a hand on your head and holds you there. I compromised the way field people do when they suspect they are alone. I would extend the leg by a small amount and call that thorough. I would not change the mission. I would collect better reasons to do so later. I set the Yagi to a narrow beam and slid the gains slowly up until the trace lifted in a measured hill. Then I lowered it until the hill should have sunk. It did not, and instead a second hill rose beside it like a twin that disliked sharing. I turned a half step and the second hill followed my turn, as if tied to my shoulder. The first stayed where it was. I wrote it down, though I already knew I would need better words. Primary signal persistent under gain reduction, secondary follows operator orientation. The phrase looked absurd in my notebook. I underlined it anyway. The page felt warm through the paper, warm in a way that made the pen leave a softer line, as if the ink itself had thinned. I tried a human test. I shut my eyes and spoke my name and the day's purpose in a flat inspector's tone. The air carried the words away and did not return them. Then I whispered the same thing so quietly that I could barely hear myself. The valley gave it back as if I had spoken into a tile basin. It shaved off the husk of my whisper and kept the shape. I felt the skin pulled tight in the space behind my ears. Quiet words survive, I wrote. Loud ones vanish or split. I didn't like the moral of that, but I liked that there was a rule at all. You can work with rules. You can file them and ask for a taller ladder. I cut across the dead zone again to test whether the circle would accept me with the Yagi held low like a rod dousing an unseen vein. Inside the quiet, the handset's display, that lying bar, went blank, but the speaker gave a soft tooth-on-glass squeak that repeated at an even rhythm. Not a voice. Not a carrier I recognized. It sounded like someone turning a dial by fractions and overshooting, correcting, overshooting, correcting. A patient mechanical person learning how to be careful. I let it play until my throat tightened. When I stepped out of the circle, the squeak stopped as if a hand had been taken off a small wheel. The echo found me again at the boundary, returned a tight copy of the word I had in my mouth at that moment, which happened to be the beginning of a warning I planned to say to no one. I reached the old mining fan east of the wash, a rayed scatter of lighter stone, and set the Yagi on it to cool the idea that I might be the only warm thing provoking this place. With the antenna settled, the logger kept its hills alive, little cities in the glass. I crouched and placed my palm on the stone and felt a minute tremor, not from human machines, not from a passing truck. This felt like the throb you sense through a rail when you are far from the engine, a voice in the material that carries beyond hearing. I thought of buried cable and scolded myself for romance. Then I pulled my palm away, and the tremor lingered a breath in my wrist like an aftertaste. I checked batteries by weight again. They felt marginally lighter, which means nothing and also everything when you are tired. I swapped one on principle to tell myself I had done something practical. The new one clicked into the handset with a small, bright confidence. I raised the Yagi and the second hill on the trace slid closer to the first, as if drawn by the act of readiness. I said, as if to a coworker on the far side of a wall, that I would attempt a sign-off to the truck recorder from this position. The valley repeated sign-off while I was still shaping the word. It had learned to anticipate me by a sliver. The difference between echo and near echo is short in a book and long in a spine. I turned one slow circle with the antenna and tried to find a corner where nothing answered. There was none. The valley was awake in all directions by tiny degrees. The smell of hot coin came and went on the breeze that did not reach the skin. I saw the shadow of a vulture slide over the ground and disappear into the dead zone without changing shape. I listened to the quiet there in my head and did not move to follow. The checklist whispered the next line the way a familiar prayer does when you are too tired to think. Continue sweep, note deviation, do not chase. I folded the list up inside the hood of my cap and began the next leg, one foot then another, because walking is the smallest rule and it holds. I took the next leg along a faint bench where the mud crust turned to tiny plates, the kind that break with a soft chirp under the boot and leave pale undersides showing. The bench kept me a little higher than the wash and gave the Yagi a cleaner mouth to the valley. I let the booms settle on my shoulder and counted a handful of slow breaths just to flatten my pulse. The logger's hills had learned patience. The primary held its seat and the secondary shadowed my posture like a polite twin. I reset the gain to my baseline and told the recorder I was beginning a horizon check, then stopped and listened for my own words to come back. Nothing. The air carried the sentence away the normal way and let it die. When I spoke the same thing under my breath, the valley returned it as if I had pitched a pebble into a covered well. That was its rule again. The quiet words kept their shape. The horizon through the sunhood had the look of a straight edge laid on soft dough. Heat put its fingers under the line and lifted it, then let it sink. I swung the Yagi level with the ridge notch and held it there for a long, unkind moment. The trace put on another hill, not quite twins now. The new one set a little farther to the right like a younger sibling catching up. I lowered the array and the hill did not sink with it. I lifted one arm and let the antenna dip, testing whether the hill loved the metal or loved me. The hill sidled toward the original and then stopped as if embarrassed. I said into the handset's steady voice that the valley's floor showed a mobile null and a merchant of small carriers. The phrase was for the form, but I put it in my own ear to hear what the place would do with it. Sign-off came back tiny, like a shop bell willing to be good. Near the center of the bench, the ground changed density. My boots told me before my eyes did. The crust gave up its chirp and went to a subtle rubber, as if the plates had rearranged themselves under a thin skin. I put a palm to the ground and found the same tremor I had felt on the mining fan, barely there, a throb that wasn't engine or aircraft, but rather a message in the material, too slow to call a tone. When I lifted my hand, the feel stayed in the bones for a few beats. The smell here carried less coin and more baked gypsum. The handset lay quiet until I edged a foot forward into that slack-skinned patch. Then the speaker let a single dry tick through. Not static, not a carrier falling off a cliff. A tap like a solitary grain hitting paper from a great height. I looked up out of habit. The sky held nothing but sun and a hawk pinned to it. I tried to be an honest worker and not a chaser. I marked the patch with a small stack of flat fragments and wrote a line that would explain itself to a tired reader later. Ground soft under crust, low mechanical pulse in substrate, isolated tap audible at boundary. Then I stood at the edge of the patch and did a horizon trick. I made myself into a piece of gear. I kept my shoulders square and lifted the Yagi to parallel the ridge and held the hand set out to the side like a counterweight. The mirage pool that had been a lake and then a mirror now made a thin, bright lane. While I stood very still, the lane stayed thin. When I rocked my weight heel to toe, the lane grew into a clear band that ran from me toward the arroyo mouth. If I leaned, the band leaned as if on hinges fastened to my hips. The logger's secondary hill rose when the band thickened and fell when I centered again. I whispered a word just to mark the moment. The band shimmered in the shape of a wave that took a breath to travel its length and then vanished into the wash. I told the recorder I was going to check the rim of the dead zone again. The silence circle had drifted since last pass. Always small, always polite, always in the way. It had settled now at the foot of an old fence post fallen sideways like a rib bone. I stepped inside with the Yagi raised and watched the handset go dull by degrees. The squeak started again, tooth on glass, turning by little increments with a patience that made me feel watched without being seen. I spoke the first half of my call sign, cut it short on purpose, and listened. The squeak missed a beat and resumed. I walked a slow spiral toward the center, careful not to fool myself into thinking I could catch a boundary that moved only when I moved. At the center, there was no smack of change, only a slightly thicker silence, like being under a blanket your body is warmed. I backed out and followed the mirage lane toward the arroyo, with the logger riding my hip. The lane asked me to keep a certain posture. If I slumped, the band scattered. If I stood tall, the line stayed tight. I tied the habit to something rational. Antenna pattern, human body rudely acting like an element, brain inventing order in noise. The arroyo wall showed fresh crumbs wrong for a windless day. The tracks I had argued with earlier had mended themselves where the blur had been and frayed where they had been sure. I crouched and sniffed for a dead battery I still had not found, and got instead the smell of dust, warmed in a plastic casing. The logger laid a little city of teeth across its screen, and I wished for a second screen to catch what my eyes felt. I wanted a Faraday pocket and had nothing but field scraps. I took the sun hood off and held it taut between two hands like a curtain, then crouched to shape it over the handset and Yagi grip to fake a shield. It made no good science, but sometimes you have to trap yourself into a poor experiment to get free of it. Under the hood, the squeak flattened, then resolved into a near voice that wasn't language, only the suggestion of someone trying shapes against the mouth of a bottle. When I pulled the hood away, the suggestion turned back to that tiny, precise turning. I said softly into the low shade of the hood, "We are done here for now." And the valley returned, "We are done here," missing the last piece like a child who remembers the song but not the coda. I walked until the bench dropped toward the wide floor, stopping now and then so I could arrange the world back into 3 points. When I kept my eyes still, the notch, the poles, and the dent agreed. When I moved them, the poles drifted toward a coordinate that did not exist on my paper map, something inward of the line I had drawn in town. The feeling of being off by a small angle can sour a day. I stood and closed one eye to lie to my depth perception into telling me that the world still had corners. It helped enough to keep the part of me that wanted to sit down under the truck from winning. The logger's primary hill eased down as I approached a scatter of pale cobbles that had tumbled from the fan. The secondary did not ease. It leaned closer to the primary, nearly touching. I turned so that the Yagi faced the empty highway and the hills kissed on the screen and became one. I turned back to the valley and they parted again. I did the childish thing and repeated it, left then right, highway then valley, and the hills obliged me like trained animals. The handset gave a low brushing sound, as if a sleeve had passed near its mic and then stopped on purpose. I said nothing for a little while, and the brushing did not restart. It seemed to like something in the act of me choosing to speak. Orders came back to me then, as they do when you stand too long in heat. Do not escalate. Do not invent an adversary. Document. I thought of the crew that would roll through here later with their own checklists and a cooler full of lunch, and how the valley might empty itself for them, and let them believe they had solved me as a story told by a tired person. I felt both possessive and ashamed, a child's split. I chose work. I set up a slow azimuth sweep, hold the antenna on a quadrant, breathe, log the hill, move a fraction, repeat. I did it until the sun shifted just enough to throw a new edge on the stones, and the mirage lane refilled like a canal. At one point, facing the ridge, I saw my silhouette in the bright skin on the ground, and it did something odd. It lifted the Yagi before I did. For the smallest slice of time, my outline raised its metal, and then my muscles followed. I told myself the sequence was a trick of how I watched, that I had decided to lift, and the watcher inside me had shouted ahead to my eyes. I repeated it to prove the lie. This time the outline waited and then jumped as if catching up, and I preferred that because it let me pretend I was in charge. I wrote, "Horizon reflection appears to anticipate operator motion at times, visual effect uncertain." I tapped the pen against my teeth and tasted heat and ink. At the fan's edge, the tremor returned and my palm read it like a letter pressed into paper. The letter said nothing and also everything. I wanted to ask a coworker what they thought of a moving silence and a copycat hill. Wanted the soft grumble of another throat to tell me I was not bending myself around nothing. Instead, the valley gave me my name in my own quiet voice without me saying it. It came so light that for a moment I believed I had thought it. Then it came again, less light, and I knew the place had learned a shape of me I had not offered on purpose. I said into the handset, "Field unit signing off this leg," and the return said, "Field unit signing," stopping there as if a door had closed between us. I stood long enough for the sweat to mark the sling across my shirt in a darker band. The smell of coin softened. The brushing sound did not return. The hills on the logger learned to sit apart again like siblings, satisfied with the rules for now. I put the hood back on and tightened the strap under my chin. The valley gave me no further instructions. I stepped out of the bench and back onto the plain where the dead zone wore its lid at a different angle than before, and I walked along its edge with the Yagi held low as if not to wake a sleeping thing I had already woken. I eased back toward the center of the floor with the Yagi held across my chest so I could feel any tug before I heard it. The silence lid had slid again, a pale circle against the shimmer that you could only see if you looked past it. I had marked its edge with a little cairn of crust plates earlier, and now that cairn sat just inside the quiet, as if the place had eaten the marker rather than moved past it. I told the recorder that I would enter for a limited pass, posture low, voice minimal, handset guarded. Saying it trimmed the fear into something I could fit into a line. The squeak met me a few steps in, that tooth-on-glass patience, turning, correcting, turning again. Beneath it, so faint I thought it my pulse, came a dry murmur with no consonants, the kind of syllable shape you make when you practice speaking without wanting to be heard. Inside, the air felt thicker at the ears, as if a soft hat had been pulled down. The handset's lying bar went to sleep, and yet the speaker carried the small sound with ease. I kept my voice to a rationed whisper and tried a field fragment, checking center, no transmit, passive only. The place gave back checking center and stopped early, as though the quiet preferred clauses that could be finished. I walked a slow spoke outward with the antenna pointed at the ridge notch. The logger rode my hip and built a city of small hills that rose and fell with my stance rather than with the environment. When I knelt, the hills softened. When I stood tall, they stacked like boxes on a dolly. I had never seen a sweep that liked posture more than position. I tested the edge with the oldest trick I know, the one a person learns carrying a radio into basements. I placed the handset on the ground, speaker up, then stepped away one pace and spoke a single word toward it, quiet enough that it should not have carried. The return came from the speaker, not from the air, and it came with a polished tone, as if the valley had run my syllable through a soft cloth before handing it back. I let myself think the word beautiful, just to prove I had not lost that kind of language in the heat. I retrieved the handset like you lift a sleeping animal, slow and from the side, and tucked it under the sun hood briefly to see if the near voice would prefer shade. It did not. The squeak continued, patient, almost reassuring in its refusal to become more. When I stepped out of the circle, the valley exhaled. The bar woke as if nothing had happened. The breath of warm coin thinned in the breeze, and the wider world came back to its wider tricks. I cut toward the old fence line that the map insisted was once a boundary for cattle, and now marked only the idea of a line. Each fallen post made a low shadow where lizards would normally stake a claim, but I saw none. The bench plates snapped again underfoot, a comfort in their predictability. I set the Yagi on a sideways post to let my shoulders rest and thought about orders. Do not escalate. Do not invent, document. The valley had given me just enough to make the small disobediences seem like good work. A circle that moved across the floor when my eyes were elsewhere. A voice that would say half of what I said and reject the rest. A hill on the logger that liked to follow my turning rather than any known source. I called the truck recorder on simplex with a half-bored tone meant to calm my own nerves and said I would run a sign-off test from the fence line, then resume the sweep toward the fan. The reply arrived in the valley's voice, my voice shaved down, and it stepped on the end of my sentence as if the place had anticipated my breath. Field unit sign, it said, and I heard the hyphen more than the letters, a small clamp closing on the thought. I tried again with a different word, the same clamp, a little sooner. I set the handset down on the post and backed away to prove I wasn't chasing my own mouth. The clamp arrived without me touching the key, a tiny, sharp curtailment, as if someone on the other end had grown tired and begun to nod off. When I lifted the Yagi from the post, the booms prickled in my palms. Static is too big a word. This was the sensation of a cat walking along a wire far away, weight almost nothing but shape undeniable. I turned until the booms faced the old mining fan and the logger offered a new hill, tall and narrow, a thing that wanted you to believe in it. I breathed once and it stayed. I took a long step backward and it didn't move. I twisted at the waist and the narrow hill leaned to keep me in its sightline. I whispered a number by habit and stopped myself. The rule against digits had grown into a superstition that felt practical. I whispered instead a nonsense length, long enough to pass a breath through. The valley returned the length in a tone like a recorder played in a tile room, polite and exact. The arroyo drew me again because the tracks there had become an argument with my earlier note. The same pairs of prints, the same long slides, but now the soft edges had been sharpened along one side as if a broom had passed. On the other side, the blur had widened into an uneven fan. I took fresh photos and gave the recorder a patient line about possible animal activity reshaping impressions. Even as I said it, the battery smell came back with a sweetness that had not been there before. Not acid or leak, more like a warm casing that had been held in a hand. I pressed my palm to the mud face and felt the now familiar thrum that was not traffic, not aircraft, not human machine unless buried deeper than any service has budget for. When I drew my hand away, the thrum lingered in the heel of my palm, like a stamp you cannot see. At the edge of the dead zone, the squeak shifted character. It lengthened into a small, careful scale, a child running a finger up a comb tooth by tooth, and then pausing, as if waiting to be praised. I did not praise it. I kept my voice low and dull, and said that I would be leaving the circle to resume corridor confirmation, and that any further exchange would be logged later. The valley returned, leaving the circle, and then held that, refusing me the second clause. A pedestrian scrap of my own speech sounded suddenly strange when handed back by someone else. I realized then that the cost here was time more than battery or sweat. The place was drawing me into a conversation, one clipped echo at a time, a call and answer with missing measures. If I stayed, I would begin to speak in the quiet way that it liked, and that would be a kind of agreement. The sun slid down just enough to sand the shadows. Heat rose off the floor in thin curtains that made the fence line look like it was nodding. I took a measured leg toward the north-spur again, not for comfort, but because elevation often makes nonsense behave for a moment. The logger settled to a line with little hairs, like a field mown, but for a few stubborn stalks. The handset went calm. The smell of coin fell away. The valley in that posture felt empty and honest. From up there, I could see the whole loop I had walked scratched into the floor like a drawing, my own boots a faint erasure where salt lay thin. The dead zone showed itself as a pale dent. If you looked with the corner of your eye, a trick of sheen more than color. I keyed up a sign-off meant to end the leg clean, and the place cut it a breath ahead of my mouth. Field unit came from the speaker in that tiled tone, trim and eager, like a clerk anticipating a name. I silenced the mic and spoke the words only in my throat, without giving them to the air. The speaker stayed quiet a long moment, and then gave a faint copy of what I had not said. It was wrong in the way a dream copy is wrong, missing the shape of the consonants, carrying only the ghost of the syllable count. My mouth went dry. The logger drew a single needle line and held it. I placed the handset on the tailgate and stepped back, then forward, a dance I have done in storms to watch how lightning likes a body. The copy came again when my chest moved in the rhythm of speech, even without sound. I had not intended to teach the valley that trick. Now it would not forget. I closed the notebook and wrote on the back cover, a place I save for truths that do not belong in forms, not alone in channel. Response anticipates intention at times. Silence is the only thing it does not mimic. The words looked stark there, too bold for a line that would cross a desk in town. I kept them anyway. The old rule about not naming what you cannot change felt heavier than the Yagi on my shoulder. The heat softened into that late glare that makes metal sing. The hawk cut a single slow arc and vanished into higher air. The mirage lane thinned until it was only a suggestion. The dead zone held its pale lid a short walk from my tailgate, not menacing, simply present, like a closed door in a house you have been asked not to open. I told the recorder I was concluding the midday pass and would shift to the far fan to check the corridor one more time before returning to town. The valley returned, concluding the midday, and stopped itself with a little click that carried the satisfaction of a stapled page. I didn't ask it for more. I lifted the Yagi, felt the booms ring against the hot air, and stepped off along the line where the floor pretended to be level, the silent circle, keeping pace at the edge of my vision, the way a reflection follows a window. I gave the corridor one more honest pass from the far fan, not because I expected the valley to behave, but because the form in town would ask whether I had closed my loops. The fan spread under my boots like pale ribs. I set the Yagi to a patient beam and let the logger walk its sweep with slow teeth, pausing at each rise to confirm that it was not wishful thinking. The primary hill was tame again, the secondary present but less eager, as if my stubbornness had bored it. I checked the spare batteries by their weight and swapped one that felt too close to light. The new one seated with a clean little clack that sounded like permission. I took a slow drink and let the sunhood drape lower over my eyes until the world narrowed to a band of ground no wider than a truck lane. The heat made the air flicker, and my mind wanted small things to focus on. I gave it the list. Confirm horizon lock, verify null shape, attempt sign-off, observe delay behavior, file what belongs on paper and keep the rest in the mouth of memory. From the fan's edge, I could see the old fence line lie across the floor like a sentence someone had tried to erase. The dead zone lid had settled nearer to the truck, pale and round, a dollop of quiet laid down by a careful hand. I didn't like the pull that put on my chest. I told the recorder I would attempt a formal sign-off from elevation and then again from the floor for control. I kept my voice level, captain of a very small ship, and I waited not because I expected a reply but because the habit is to give the air time to settle. The valley let my words go without a copy. That should have been a comfort. I took a breath meant to clear the board and keyed up the handset with the clean phrasing I use when the job is finished. Field unit concluding corridor verification, returning to base. The speaker stayed quiet and the logger's line held steady as if bored. I waited, listening to the wind's fine grit on the booms, and decided to say the same thing softer. The place repeated concluding corridor before I had finished forming the last word, a neat little cut, as if it had decided to tidy my sentence to its own taste. I tried a different end. Returning to town. The copy came as returning, full stop, a period put in by someone else's hand. I felt a small heat at the back of my neck that wasn't the sun. I walked down from the fan with my body turned a little sideways so I could keep the truck and the lid both in sight. The smell of coin rose again where the plates began, then thinned as I left the bench. I heard a single dry tick from the speaker when my boot hit the floor proper, not the squeak from inside the circle but a sharper thing, like a seed striking a window. The logger put on a tall needle that blinked once and then hid. I told myself that nerves and electronics share a language, and it does no good to panic when they speak at once. At the fence line, the fallen posts lay in their low shade. I rested the Yagi across one to let my hands unknot. The horizon did its slow nod, and I did mine. The 3 points tried to slide. I spoke them under my breath and held them still. Notch, poles, dent, everything has its charm, even a lie you can steady for a moment. I keyed the handset with the same clean sign-off, voice flatted, cadence like a clerk. The valley said field unit and then stopped, as if it had grown shy. I waited. A small brushing sound passed, a sleeve across a mic, and then nothing. I tried the truck recorder on a separate tone, a redundant habit that keeps people from going home late. The speaker gave me the same clipped beginning, and then an empty line where the rest should have been. I walked to the edge of the dead zone and set the handset on the ground just outside, speaker up, then stepped inside with the Yagi held low, as if courtesy mattered to a circle. The squeak greeted me, patient as ever. I did not speak. The speaker outside the circle gave the word returning in my voice, small and tidy, and then hushed again. I had not said it. My mouth had thought it, or the place had learned to fold my breath into a shape. I felt the prickling at the base of the skull that sometimes precedes a headache. I pressed 2 fingers there and counted without counting until the pressure eased. I brought the handset in under the sun hood and tried a test that was not science but might serve a form of it. I lifted the antenna high and lowered my voice to a Wells whisper, the kind used to coax a signal out of heavy weather. I said the phrase everyone says when a day is done. The place repeated only the middle, as if it preferred the part without agency. I placed the handset on the dirt and backed out of the circle. The bar woke at once, pleased to be needed again. I keyed and said strongly now that I was signing off. The valley said sign and clipped itself, a neat little haircut. The time cost showed itself in the body. Shoulder tight from holding the Yagi against the tremor I could not name. Throat dry from weighing each word and giving only a portion. A person can lose an afternoon to careful speech. Orders wrote up again like a song you can't unlearn. Do not escalate. Do not converse with an unknown system in the field beyond what is necessary. The moral felt clear and stupid. Necessary is a sliding thing when you stand alone in white light and the place around you tries on your voice like a found jacket. I made a small act of obedience to settle my hands. I packed the logger into foam and latched the case, laid the Yagi on the tailgate pad, inspected the cokes for any fleck of grit, capped the connectors, coiled with patience. I put the batteries in their pouch by weight so the light one would ride where I couldn't mistake it for full in the dark. I kept the handset out because that was not negotiable, and because a part of me wanted to see if the valley would protest the rituals of leaving. The dead zone lid had crept close enough that my boot toe could touch its boundary without a step. The air there felt a degree denser, just enough to let you know when you had put your head into a different room. I tried a final sign-off with a different structure, as if grammar might pry open a gap. Field unit ending operations, no further traffic from this site. The speaker stayed meek. Then, as I reached to clip the handset into the sling, it clicked and offered ending operations in the voice I would use telling a coworker we had done enough for one day. I wanted to answer with something soft and final. Instead, I put the set down on the tailgate, hand flat, and waited. The valley did not follow with anything else. It left the sentence like a door left just ajar. I looked across the floor toward the arroyo and saw the prints again, not where they had been, but where they would have been if someone had walked the earlier path with a broom made of light. The long slides had straightened into more decisive lines. The pairs had narrowed into steadier pairs. A loop that had jumped once now sat neatly where a careful step would fall. I told the recorder I was observing ongoing reshaping, likely due to heat and animal passage. The sentence felt like a coat you wear to impress a superior who will not come to the site. I deleted nothing. The form hates deletion. I climbed into the cab and twisted to look at the rear bench where the map lay folded on the seat. The 3 points sat honest on the paper, the notch exactly where it should be, the poles where they were planted when the county gave up on them, the dent like a thumbprint in dough. Out the windshield, the same 3 tried once more to lean. I set the map on the dash so my eyes could look at both realities at once. The one on paper held. The one outside conceded for a breath and then leaned again as if the valley had not understood the convention of lines. I said, to no one, that I would proceed to town. The speaker in the sling whispered proceed, then stopped. I turned the key and let the engine catch. The sound filled the cab with the kind of confidence only combustion can give. The dead zone's lid held its place, polite as a neighbor who does not wave. I eased the truck into gear and rolled a slow length forward. The speaker gave a nearly inaudible repetition of the small clack my shifter made, a ridiculous mimicry that made me laugh once the wrong way. The valley had learned the rhythm of me down to a small mechanical habit. I should have found that flattering. I did not. At the edge of the graded track, I braked and set the handset on the passenger seat, mic angled toward the roof. I pressed transmit and said the sign-off again, in the same tone as the beginning of my day, when I promised to keep records and stay within lines. The speaker delivered nothing. The logger, boxed and dark, could not tell me a story. The Yagi lay quiet in its sleeve. The valley chose not to answer, or it chose to answer by withholding the copy I had somehow come to expect. Either way, a rule had shifted under my boots and under my voice, and I didn't know yet what it would cost. I lifted the handset once more, not to speak, just to hold it. The plastic was warm, not unpleasant, like a tool that has remembered the shape of a hand. I set it down for good and pulled the sun hood tighter, a small chapel of shade for the road ahead. The mirror showed the circle as a pale coin on the floor behind me, still and balanced, as if nothing had moved all day but me. I pressed the accelerator and the truck agreed to leave. The speaker stayed plain and empty. The last word in the cab was the rasp of tire over crust and the soft rattle of the Yagi sleeve. My name did not come after me. The silence felt deliberate in a way that I would have to write later without that word. I took the graded track slow so I could feel the truck talk through the wheel. Dust lifted, then fell back in a sheet. The handset rode in the sling with its mic clipped to the dash, and the Yagi in its sleeve lay along the bench like a quiet passenger. I told the recorder I was conducting a drive test on exit, then let the engine settle into a steady note that any repeater on the north-spur would like. The valley floor gave way to gently rising ribs, and with each rib the hum under the tires changed character. It began as the common rattle of stone and steel, then thinned into a tighter thread that matched nothing mechanical. It was an almost sound, a presence that lived in the column and then the bones of my forearms. The smell of coin returned in a small wave and went. When I lifted my foot and let the engine drop, the thread held for a breath too long, as if the ground was finishing a sentence I had started. I saw the dead zone as a pale gloss across the track ahead, faint as a puddle under a hot sky. My earlier marker cairn was behind me by then, but the gloss had learned new ground. I stopped short and let the truck idle. The handset carried a whisper of airflow across its mic, a low constant that matched the real breeze. I rolled the truck forward until the right tire kissed the gloss. The speaker went meek at once, the same clipped silence it had offered on the floor. I rolled back and the small courage returned. I did not like that the circle had climbed into the road as if to hold the handle of the day. I told the recorder, tight-voiced, that a mobile null had intersected the egress path and that I would test with short controlled entries only. Saying it gave me a bit of leash to hold. I laid the logger on the hood in its foam and unlatched it because I could not leave this without a trace. Orders said do not escalate, and a part of me said that unpacking on the road counted as escalation. Another part said the form would read better with a line that did not rely on mood. I compromised the way field workers do when they believe the tool will forgive them. The logger blinked awake and drew its clean line. I set the Yagi along the roofline with the booms forward at a slight cant. Then I eased the truck into the gloss once more. The handset dimmed. The logger picked up a narrow climb that flowed over the baseline like a slow shudder. I backed out and the climb fell, then hesitated, then lay flat very politely. I repeated the gentle kiss at the edge and got the same tidy rise. I whispered a fragment to the mic, a little part of a sign-off, and the speaker answered only the center of the phrase, then put it down as if not interested in the rest. I cut the engine to hear the ground better. The silence reached into the cab like a soft glove, and the hum did not end with the last shake of the motor, but kept on, a small pulse under the seat that seemed to know how to be regular without being precise. My palms remembered the mining fan and the tremor there. The same story lived now in the foam of the seat. I set the handset on the dashboard and watched the lying bar fall asleep and wake and fall again through its habits. The speaker picked a tiny detail out of the new quiet. The tick of the cooling manifold clicked once, and the speaker returned it a hair later, neat and shy, as if practicing a trick. I didn't praise it. I wrote, "Ground pulse persists independent of engine. Null intersects track. Imitation now includes non-voice cabin noises." When I restarted the truck, the circle had drifted a short span farther up. Not much, just a body length, enough to make me feel followed. I drove toward it because there was no other lane in this kind of country, and the place met me with that mild remove. Inside the gloss, the Yagi's sleeve rattled once against the bench, and the speaker gave that rattle back as a thinner cousin. The logger drew a single sharp hill and held it, like a post you could tie to. When I eased past the far side, everything released so gently that I could have believed I had imagined the tension. I kept the pace steady and the wheel firm. When the track split around a low bulge, I took the left fork, not because it was better, but because I wanted to see if the circle would choose. It took the left with me by a sliver, as if humored by the test. As the grade rose, I made a brief stop by a culvert where old fencing wire had caught and gathered like a nest. The wire sang very softly in the moving air, a sound the desert makes for itself, and the handset took that song and paired it to a single clean thread. Under my boots, the ribs of the fan carried that same slow pulse. I placed my palm on the iron rim of the culvert and felt an answer rise into bone. Not cold, not heat, not true vibration, a ghost sign that made my fingers want to close into a fist. I forced the hand open and took a breath that tasted of warm plastic and dust. In the near distance, the ridge notch looked honest again, and the poles minded their spacing, but only when I held still. The moment I moved my eyes, the notch leaned a fraction. I spoke its name, and it behaved. I thought of the shop and its cheerful fluorescent light, and the bench where someone else would lay the handset open and make to blame the mic or a cracked solder at the speaker. I thought of the modest room in town where forms are read by people who prefer clean lines and sentences that end early. I said to no one that I would comply. The speaker said, "Comply," a little late, and then nothing. I put the logger back in its foam and latched the case for good. I slung the Yagi into its sleeve and tied it down with a strap you could open with gloves. I told the recorder in a steady tone that I would acknowledge corridor constraints, recommend caution for other field crews, and request a more comprehensive pass with partners. Then I shut the recorder off because my own voice had begun to sound like a guide talking to a worried child. Back in the cab, I felt the hum transfer to the pedals as a fine sand underfoot. I said the sign-off cleanly and without decoration, and the speaker clicked once as a period. I drove. The valley did not chase me in any theatrical way. It paralleled. When I glanced into the mirror, the coin of quiet hung a little to one side of the track, keeping pace as if we were two vehicles on neighboring lanes that shared a destination. A hawk shadow crossed my hood and the speaker did not play it. That felt like mercy. The smell of coin went faint until it was only the memory of a smell. Near the junction with the highway, the graded surface gave up and let the asphalt claim me. The tires took on a new tone, a hum that any city could recognize, and the handset made no imitation of it. For a short time, the day behaved. The 3 points became 2 as the ridge fell behind the cab's roofline, and I let the map on the dash become ceremonial. I said into the empty cab that I was returning with notes and that I would not stop again unless the truck asked me to. The speaker did not return my plan. It gave me the smallest scrape at the word notes, then went back to being equipment. On the highway, I saw the road's measured signs pass, each announcing a slice of distance in a way that pleases managers and leaves field bodies cold. I didn't say the numbers, since I do not give the world digits when the world will use them to count me back. I watched the signs anyway and felt a hitch. Two passed too close together for the ground they named, or I passed them too slowly for the engine's note. The effect was mild, a tug rather than a shove, but it asked for belief. I set 2 fingers on the dash and kept them there like a sailor counting swells to feel whether the sea had indeed changed. The hand set, bored now or sated, rode quiet as any brick. I reached a turnout with a view back across the valley and took it so I could make the last test without movement. I let the engine idle for a minute and then cut it. Heat rolled through the open windows like a living thing relieved to be let in. I set the handset on the seat and the sun hood over it so the plastic would not scald my palm when I picked it up. The circle was visible even from here, if you looked with the not looking that I had practiced all afternoon. A pale gloss that did not care about asphalt or track and simply lay where it pleased. I picked up the handset and felt no static, no tremor. I spoke my name very quietly, for myself. The speaker did not play it. I set the handset down and felt the ordinary texture of the seat through my fingers. The valley did not answer. The hum in the bones went back to being my pulse. The form would want a conclusion. The form would ask if corridor coverage was confirmed and whether the earlier hiss was due to heat alone. I could answer those charitably. I could write that the north-spur performed to expectation about as often as the rules demand, that the floor gave false calm at times, that an operator's choice of posture might influence readings under certain noon conditions. I could leave the part about the circle that walked with me to the margin on the back page. There's a place there for a sentence that is not entirely for the record. I would write it later when the truck had cooled and the light gone orange along the low hills, not alone in channel. Ground speaks when spoken to and sometimes even when not. I put the handset back into the sling and tightened the strap across my chest. The seat seam pressed its familiar line against my thigh. The hood's shadow made a little chapel around my eyes. I turned the key and let the engine find its voice. The valley lay behind me like a thought I would choose to have again and again until it behaved. I pulled out onto the highway and the speakers, all of them, agreed to be nothing more than speakers. By the time I reached town, the light had gone from white to hard amber, and then softened. The yard behind the shop held the usual arrangement of spools and pallets in a faded cone that marked nothing in particular. The bay door stood up like a mouth, and the fluorescent hum inside hit the truck's cab before the tires touched concrete. I parked at my spot out of habit, the one with the dark stain that looks like a map in rain. I shut the engine down and waited a breath to see if anything tried to finish the sentence for me. The handset on the seat kept its polite quiet. The smell of dust lifted from the dash and settled into the air like a familiar coat. Inside the shop, the bench waited with its green mat and its little clear bins of parts that only ever make sense when they are in your fingers. I laid out the gear in the order we teach new hands. Yagi sleeve opened, Cokes coiled loose, logger on foam, handset centered on a clean towel like a patient. I washed my palms at the sink and watched the thin line of water carry grit away until it ran clear. The fluorescent buzz did the thing it always does to the jaw. I slipped the sun hood off and hung it on the peg so the light could find me. A field day ends when you make your own desk look like someone else's, clean and provisional. I told myself I would not chase anything here. Bench test only, paper after. I powered the logger and let it breathe. In the shop it should lie flat, a calm that does not need witness. It did at first. Then it made a modest lift at the lower side, not a hill, just a polite shrug that any fan motor could apologize for. I cut the bench fan, listened to the buzz settle, and watched the line lay back down. When I leaned for the notebook, the line picked a small tooth and set it beside the baseline like a white grain on a dark table. I froze, and the tooth sank. I leaned the other way, and the tooth appeared again, not quite in the same place, as if following the hinge of my shoulder. I wrote the observation and did not bother to underline it. Even here, posture had its say. The hand set on the towel felt warm through the cloth when I put my palm above it. I lifted it gently and set it near the edge of the bench, then cupped it with the hood the way I had in the field. The speaker offered a sound so small I could have been inventing it. A micro scrape, like a glove on metal. I told the room, in a voice trained for late hours, that I would run a quiet diagnostic. The speaker gave back the middle of the sentence in that tiled tone the valley had used, a clipped courtesy that stopped before the verb that would carry me into action. I stood there in the artificial light with a radio that wanted to return only the parts of me that asked for nothing. I took the battery out and set it aside by weight. The handset is a brick without its heart. The speaker should have no voice. It had none. The hum of the room settled on my shoulders like a towel taken from a line. I put the battery back and the set woke with the little throat clearing that is only circuitry. I did not key. I watched the mic hole without looking at it. The speaker, after a time, repeated the pause I had allowed myself the way a companion will match your breathing when they mean to calm you. I told it softly that I was not speaking. It offered not speaking back as if to be helpful. I opened the locker that we pretend is a shield. It is just a metal box that lets a worker believe for a moment that belief is a variable. I placed the handset inside on a folded towel and closed the door without latching. The fluorescent buzz receded behind the metal and came back through other routes. I put my ear to the seam and heard the flat. Nothing you hear when you imagine deep water. I said the word that ends a shift in a tone that meant no one would argue. Nothing came through. I opened the locker and took the brick back into shoplight and said the word again in my throat without giving it air. The speaker breathed the syllables ghost. No consonants, just the measure. I felt that small pull behind my ears again, the one that makes a person think of high places and edges. The shop smells like solvent and cardboard by evening. It is honest about it. I let that steadiness sit against the day's stranger notes. I wrote the form wanted, line by line, the plain story in plain phrases, corridor coverage adequate through most of the floor, localized null observed, intermittent low carriers near lower edge, human posture influences sweep under midday heat. I let the pen make its quiet scratches and I resisted the urge to justify every choice I had made. In the margin where I usually mark a polite weather note, I wrote a sentence I do not think I fully meant yet. Recommend return with partner and full kit when air is heavy but not cruel. That is the kind of sentence a person writes when they plan to go whether permission comes or not. I kept the back cover for the truths that are not for the form. There I wrote the line I had spoken into the valley and not admitted to the recorder. Not alone in channel. Anticipation present in return path at times. I capped the pen and breathed in the smell of ink and plastic, and I felt a small relief that someone had made these simple things. On the bench, the handset sat with the patience of an animal that has learned a trick and is waiting to see if you will ask for it. I tried a late test that any shop worker might try when no one else is around. I dimmed the lights by a switch that sticks and makes a hard click. In the half room, the fluorescent buzz settled lower and the shadows from the bins took longer bodies. I said my name the way you say it at a counter when you are picking up a parcel. I didn't give the radio the courtesy of a key. The speaker did not play it. I had a brief, ordinary joy at that. Then, without me willing it, I thought my name with the distinct rhythm of a spoken word, and the speaker offered only the middle of it, the soft part that is neither beginning nor end. I turned the lights back up so that the shop could be a shop again and not a place where I might be tempted to bargain. I packed the logger and wrapped the Yagi sleeve tight so it would not sing in the bed. I put the batteries where they belong by weight and not by label, because weight tells the truth in a way a sticker sometimes does not. I hung the sun hood by its strap. The shop door thunked shut with its familiar little sigh. Outside, town air carried the smell of deep-fried something from the place down the street and the sweetness of cut grass from a yard that fusses with itself. I felt no hum in the pavement under my boots. The truck's door creaked a friendly protest at being asked to work again. Before I left, I sat with the door open and watched the yard. The night insects started to throw their thin voices against the walls. I set the handset in the cup holder where it could see nothing but the inside of a truck. I didn't speak. The speaker did not either. I put my hand over it without touching and held it there. The plastic held the heat it had learned in the day and let it go slowly. Somewhere out beyond the edge of town, the valley lay with its gloss coin on the floor, and its polite circle creeping across track and bench and wide ground, not hunting, not chasing, only repeating and trimming the world to a shape that pleased it. Or that is how I thought of it, so that the drive home would be possible. I started the engine and let the idle smooth itself as it always does. The radio stayed a radio. The road under the tires made the sound every road makes in the last of the light. A crosswalk sign blinked at an intersection and kept its interval like a metronome that has never known a hand. At a red light, I tried the clean sign-off that ends a day, spoke it the way you tell yourself you will return, not theatrical, not for the recorder, simply so that a habit could have its run. The speaker did not copy it. The window showed my face, sunhood lines stamped across the brow, sweat dried to salt, and behind that the shop sign in reverse. When the light changed, I made the turn and did not look back until the highway took the town away from the glass. Only then did the speaker, very gently, offer the middle of the phrase I had said at the light, the part that does not promise anything, the part that belongs to anyone. It came so softly that I could have claimed the truck's fan had done it, or a seam in the dash, or tiredness. I let it be that for the length of a breath and then another. I drove on with the valley behind me and the road ahead and the bench waiting for morning when rooms and tools make their arguments in daylight. I did not give the radio any more words. The night did not insist.